Sarah thought Max was dead. For 6 months, she had cried herself to sleep every night. But when her dog returned, what he brought with him forced her to call the police. Because Max hadn't just come home. He had transformed into a hero. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The clock on Sarah Coleman's kitchen wall ticked with mechanical precision, each second stretching into eternity. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in September, and the small house in rural Oregon felt more like a tomb than a home. Rain hammered against the windows with relentless fury, each drop striking the glass like tiny stones thrown by an angry god. The storm had been raging for 3 hours, transforming the quiet countryside into a battleground of wind, water, and darkness. Sarah sat curled on her worn leather couch, her fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The ceramic felt rough against her palms, a texture she'd grown familiar with during countless sleepless nights over the past 6 months. Her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, the kind of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from carrying a weight too heavy for one person to bear. The living room around her told the story of her grief in painful detail. Dog toys still scattered across the hardwood floor, untouched since that terrible night in March. A red rubber ball sat in the corner, covered in a thin layer of dust, waiting for a game of fetch that would never come. The large dog bed by the fireplace remained perfectly arranged, its blue plaid pattern still showing the impression of a body that had once curled there every night. On the coffee table in front of her sat a framed photograph, the edges worn smooth from countless hours of Sarah's fingers tracing the image. It showed her with Max, her golden retriever mix, both of them squinting against the summer sun in her backyard. Max's tongue hung out in a dopey grin, his thick golden coat shining like spun silk. Sarah's arm was wrapped around his neck, her face radiant with the kind of joy that only comes from unconditional love. That photograph had been taken just 3 days before everything changed forever. Thunder rolled across the Oregon hills, shaking the house down to its foundation. Sarah flinched at the sound, her mind automatically returning to that night 6 months ago when another storm had stolen away the most important thing in her life. She closed her eyes, but the memories came anyway, vivid and merciless. It had been March 15th, a date now burned into her consciousness like a brand. Sarah had been running late for her shift at Mercy General Hospital, where she worked as a trauma nurse. The evening had started normally enough. She'd come home from her previous shift, exhausted and looking forward to a quiet night with Max. But as she'd settled in to watch television, her supervisor had called. "Sarah, I know it's your night off, but we're swamped. Johnson called in sick and Martinez is stuck in surgery. Can you come in for a few hours?" Sarah had looked at Max, who was lying by her feet, his intelligent brown eyes watching her face as if he understood every word. Something about his expression had seemed off that evening. He'd been restless all day, pacing from room to room, occasionally stopping to stare out the window toward the forest that bordered her property. "What's wrong, boy?" she had asked, scratching behind his ears. Max had whined softly, a sound she'd rarely heard from him. He was typically the most well-behaved dog imaginable, calm and steady in almost any situation. But Sarah's mind had been on work, on the patients who needed her, on the overtime pay that would help with her mounting student loans. She'd pushed aside the nagging feeling that something was amiss. "I'll be back in a few hours," she had told Max, grabbing her scrubs and car keys. The storm had been building all evening, dark clouds rolling in from the Pacific like an invading army. Wind had already started rattling the trees outside, and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. Max had followed her to the front door, which was unusual. Typically, he would settle into his bed when she left for work, content to wait for her return. But that night, he'd paced behind her, whining under his breath, his tail tucked low. "Stay, boy," Sarah had said firmly, opening the door just wide enough to slip through. But the moment the door opened, Max had bolted. In one fluid motion, he'd pushed past her and disappeared into the growing storm. Sarah had called his name, chasing him into the darkness in her scrubs and tennis shoes, but within seconds he'd vanished into the thick forest as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Max! Max, come back, she had screamed, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. She'd searched for over an hour, her flashlight beam cutting through the rain and darkness, illuminating nothing but empty trees and underbrush. Finally, soaked to the bone and shivering uncontrollably, she'd been forced to go inside and call the hospital to explain why she couldn't make her shift. Then she'd spent the rest of the night awake, listening for any sound of Max's return, praying she would hear his familiar bark or the click of his nails on the front porch. But morning had come with only silence. That had been 183 days ago. Sarah knew the exact count because she'd marked each one on her calendar, a ritual of grief that had become as automatic as breathing. For the first month, she'd spent every free moment searching. She'd printed hundreds of flyers with Max's picture, posting them on every telephone pole and bulletin board within a 50-mile radius. She'd called every animal shelter, rescue organization, and veterinary clinic in 3 counties. She'd walked every trail in the Cascade National Forest, calling his name until her voice gave out. She'd enlisted the help of volunteers, organized search parties, even hired a professional pet tracker who'd followed scent trails that all seemed to lead deeper into the wilderness before disappearing entirely. After 2 months with no sign of him, the professionals had gently suggested that Max was likely dead. Wild animals, they explained. Coyotes, bears, the harsh mountain winter. A domestic dog, no matter how large and intelligent, couldn't survive alone in the Oregon wilderness for long. But Sarah had refused to give up hope. She'd continued searching, even as friends and family began to worry about her obsession. She'd lost weight, her job performance had suffered, and she'd withdrawn from almost all social contact. Her entire world had narrowed to a single focus, finding Max. It wasn't until month 4 that she'd finally begun to accept the truth. Max was gone. Whatever had driven him into that storm had led him to his death, and she would never know why he'd run or what he'd been trying to tell her with those worried eyes and anxious whines. Now, sitting in her dark living room 6 months later, Sarah felt the familiar ache in her chest that had become her constant companion. Grief was a living thing, she discovered, something that breathed and grew and changed but never truly left. Some days it was a dull throb, manageable and distant. Other days, like tonight, it was a sharp blade twisting between her ribs. The storm outside intensified, and Sarah found herself thinking about Max's final moments. Had he been scared? Had he called for her as the wilderness claimed him? The not knowing was perhaps the worst part of all. She picked up the photograph again, her thumb tracing Max's golden fur. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the image. "I should have listened. I should have stayed home that night." Lightning exploded across the sky, illuminating the forest beyond her windows in stark black and white. For a brief moment, Sarah thought she saw movement among the trees, a shape that was neither wind nor shadow. But when the darkness returned, she convinced herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her grief-stricken mind. Thunder followed the lightning, a bone-deep rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. Sarah set down her coffee mug and walked to the living room window, pressing her face against the cool glass. The storm was magnificent in its fury, transforming her quiet neighborhood into something wild and primordial. She was about to turn away when she saw it again. Movement at the edge of her property, near the old oak tree where she used to hang a tire swing as a child. This time, she was certain it wasn't her imagination. Sarah's heart began to pound as she squinted through the rain-soaked glass. The figure was moving slowly, deliberately, as if fighting against the wind and rain. It was too large to be a raccoon or deer, too small to be a person. And there was something familiar about the way it moved, a gait she would recognize anywhere. No, she breathed, her pulse racing. It's not possible. She grabbed the powerful flashlight she kept by the front door, the same one she'd used in countless searches over the past 6 months. Her hands trembled as she turned the handle, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were telling her. The moment the door opened, wind and rain slammed into her like a physical force. Her hair whipped around her face as she stepped onto the covered porch, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Max," she called, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Max, is that you?" The figure stopped moving. Then, cutting through the wind and rain like a knife through silk, came a sound that made Sarah's knees weak and her heart sore. A bark. Deep, familiar, unmistakably Max. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, tears instantly mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "Oh my God, it's really you." She ran into the storm, her bare feet splashing through puddles, her pajamas immediately soaked through. The flashlight beam danced wildly as she sprinted toward the oak tree, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. And there he was. Max, thinner than she remembered, his golden coat matted with mud and debris, his eyes reflecting the flashlight beam like twin stars. But alive. Unmistakably, impossibly alive. "Max!" Sarah screamed, dropping to her knees in the mud. But as she reached for him, she noticed something that made her pause. Max wasn't running to her as she expected. Instead, he was standing perfectly still, his head lowered, something dark and bulky held carefully in his mouth. Sarah's joy transformed into confusion, then concern. "What do you have, boy?" she asked, her voice gentle but urgent. Max had always been a retriever by nature, constantly bringing her sticks, tennis balls, and the occasional dead bird. But she'd never seen him carry anything with such obvious care and purpose. Max took a few tentative steps toward her, then stopped again. With infinite gentleness, he lowered his head and placed the object on the muddy ground before backing away. His tail gave a weak wag, and Sarah could see exhaustion in every line of his body. Sarah crawled forward through the mud, her flashlight illuminating what Max had brought her. What she saw made her gasp and nearly drop the light. It was a bundle wrapped in what appeared to be a dirty blanket. But it wasn't the blanket that shocked her, it was the fact that the bundle was moving. Weak, almost imperceptible movement, but unmistakably alive. With trembling hands, Sarah carefully peeled back a corner of the sodden fabric. The flashlight beam revealed a tiny face, pale and dirt-streaked but breathing. A baby. An infant no more than a few months old, thin and obviously malnourished but very much alive. Sarah's mind went blank with shock. She stared at the impossible sight before her, her brain unable to process what she was seeing. A baby. Max had brought her a baby. In the middle of a storm, after being missing for 6 months, her dog had returned carrying a human infant. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, immediately scooping the child into her arms. The baby was cold but breathing steadily, tiny fingers moving weakly against her chest. "Max, how did you?" But Max was already moving again, trotting back toward the forest with purpose. He stopped at the tree lean and turned back to her, barking once sharply. The sound was different from his usual bark, urgent, commanding, almost desperate. Sarah looked down at the baby in her arms, then back at Max. The infant needed immediate medical attention, warmth, food. But Max's behavior suggested there was more to this story, something else waiting in the darkness of the forest. "I have to get the baby inside first," she called to Max, but the dog barked again, more insistently this time. He took several steps into the forest, then looked back at her expectantly. "Max, no," Sarah said firmly. "The baby needs help now." In response, Max began to howl. It was a sound Sarah had never heard from him before, long and mournful and filled with an almost human grief. The sound cut through the storm like a blade, raising every hair on Sarah's arms and sending chills down her spine. Whatever Max had found in the forest, whatever story this baby represented, it was far from over. Sarah struggled to her feet, the infant cradled against her chest, and ran for the house. Behind her, Max continued his heartbreaking howl, a sound that seemed to contain all the sorrow and urgency in the world. Inside, Sarah's nurse training took over. She quickly stripped the baby of its wet clothes, noting the signs of prolonged malnutrition, sunken cheeks, prominent ribs, skin that hung loosely on the tiny frame. But the child was alert, eyes focusing on her face with surprising clarity. She wrapped the infant in warm, dry towels and prepared a bottle of emergency formula she'd kept since her sister's last visit. The baby drank hungrily, tiny hands grasping weakly at the bottle. As she fed the child, Sarah's mind raced. Where had this baby come from? How long had it been in the forest? And most importantly, how had Max been caring for it? Because it was clear that someone or something had been keeping this infant alive. Despite obvious malnutrition, the baby was in relatively good condition. This wasn't a child who had been abandoned days ago. This was a child who had been surviving for weeks, maybe months. With shaking hands, Sarah reached for her phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? This is Sarah Coleman at 1247, Timber Ridge Road, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. I need police and paramedics immediately. My dog just brought me an infant. There was a pause on the other end. Ma'am, did you say your dog brought you a baby? Yes, Sarah said, looking down at the tiny face that was now sleeping peacefully in her arms. An infant, maybe 3 or 4 months old. The child appears to have been in the forest for an extended period but is alive and in stable condition. Can you repeat that, ma'am? Your dog found a baby in the forest. Sarah took a deep breath. My dog has been missing for 6 months. Tonight he returned home carrying this infant. The child needs immediate medical attention. We're dispatching units to your location immediately. Please stay on the line. While she waited for emergency responders, Sarah examined the baby more carefully. Despite the obvious signs of prolonged hardship, the infant showed no signs of serious injury or abuse. The child's diaper, though dirty, appeared to have been changed relatively recently. There were no obvious wounds, no signs of animal attacks. Someone had been caring for this baby. But who? And where? Outside, Max continued to pace by the front door, occasionally letting out soft whines. Every few minutes, he would bark sharply toward the forest, as if calling to someone or something in the darkness. 25 minutes after Sarah's call, the quiet country road exploded with emergency lights. 2 police cruisers, an ambulance, and a fire department rescue vehicle converged on her driveway, their red and blue lights painting the storm-soaked night in brilliant colors. Officer Maria Gonzalez was the first through the door, water dripping from her rain gear. She was a veteran of the county sheriff's department, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that had served her well in 20 years of dealing with the impossible. Where's the infant? She asked immediately. Sarah carefully transferred the sleeping baby to the paramedics, who began their assessment with practiced efficiency. Heart rate normal, one reported. Respiratory rate good. Signs of dehydration and malnutrition but nothing immediately life-threatening. Officer Gonzalez studied the child for a moment, then turned to Sarah. Ma'am, I need you to walk me through exactly what happened tonight. Sarah told the story as clearly as she could, starting with Max's disappearance 6 months ago and ending with his return carrying the infant. Officer Gonzalez listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in her small notebook. You said your dog has been missing for 6 months, the officer asked. Since March 15th, Sarah confirmed. The night of the last big storm. Officer Gonzalez's radio crackled to life. Unit 7, be advised we have a possible connection to your current situation. Missing person case from March. Monica Rivera, age 22, disappeared with her 3-month-old son during the storm on the 15th, vehicle found abandoned on Highway 201. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. March 15. The same night Max had disappeared. Copy that, Officer Gonzalez responded into her radio. She turned back to Sarah with a grave expression. Ma'am, we may have identified this child. If our suspicions are correct, this infant has been missing for 6 months. 6 months. Sarah repeated weakly. But that's impossible. A baby can't survive in the wilderness for 6 months. No, Officer Gonzalez agreed, looking at Max, who sat calmly by the door. A baby can't. But apparently, someone has been taking care of this child all this time. The paramedic finished his examination. Whoever's been caring for this baby has been doing a remarkable job under difficult circumstances, he reported. The malnutrition is consistent with inadequate but regular feeding. This child has been receiving consistent care. Everyone in the room turned to look at Max. The dog whined softly and pawed at the front door, his eyes fixed on the dark forest beyond. I think, Officer Gonzalez said slowly, your dog wants to show us something. An hour later, a search team had assembled at the edge of Sarah's property. The storm was beginning to weaken, though rain still fell steadily and the wind continued to howl through the trees. Officer Gonzalez led the team, which included 2 additional deputies, a crime scene technician, and a search and rescue specialist. Sarah had been allowed to join the search, against protocol but at her insistence. He's been missing for 6 months, she'd argued. If he's willing to lead us somewhere, I need to be there in case he gets spooked and runs again. Max moved through the forest with surprising confidence, his nose to the ground, following a trail invisible to human senses. His behavior was different from the anxious, desperate dog who had returned to Sarah's house. In the forest, he moved with purpose and familiarity, occasionally pausing to ensure the humans were following. The terrain was rough, made treacherous by months of fallen leaves and branches. The search team's powerful flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a landscape of towering pines and thick underbrush. The forest floor was spongy with decades of decomposing vegetation, and more than once team members slipped on hidden roots or loose rocks. After 30 minutes of steady hiking, Max suddenly stopped. He sat down in a small clearing and looked back at Sarah, then toward a thick cluster of blackberry bushes ahead. He's indicating something, the search and rescue specialist, a lean man named Tom Brady, observed. Dogs don't typically sit like that unless they've found what they're looking for. Officer Gonzalez approached the bushes cautiously, her flashlight beam probing the shadows. There's something here, she called out. Looks like some kind of structure. The team spread out, carefully pushing through the thorny undergrowth. What they discovered made everyone fall silent. Hidden behind the natural barrier of bushes was a makeshift shelter, constructed with a level of care and ingenuity that spoke of desperate resourcefulness. Fallen branches had been woven together to form a framework, covered with sheets of plastic tarp and emergency space blankets. The entrance was low and narrow, designed to conserve heat and provide protection from wind and rain. Jesus, Officer Gonzalez breathed. Someone built this. Tom Brady examined the construction with professional interest. This is survival-level craftsmanship, he said. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. The drainage is good, the insulation is adequate, and it's positioned to take advantage of natural wind breaks. Sarah approached the shelter, her heart pounding. Max trotted beside her, no longer leading but walking as if returning to a familiar place. How long has this been here? She asked. Months, from the look of it, Brady replied. Maybe longer. Officer Gonzalez carefully ducked through the entrance, her flashlight illuminating the interior. What she saw inside made her call immediately for the crime scene technician. The shelter was larger inside than it appeared from outside, with enough room for 2 or 3 people to lie down. But it was the contents that told the real story. Baby bottles, carefully cleaned and arranged on a makeshift shelf. Cans of infant formula, some empty, some partially used. Packages of diapers in various sizes, suggesting the child's growth over time. Blankets and clothing, both adult and infant sizes. And at the back of the shelter, arranged with obvious care, were the remains of a cooking fire, surrounded by a circle of stones. Nearby were the bones of small animals, rabbits, fish, birds, evidence of successful hunting and scavenging. "This is where they've been living," Officer Gonzalez said, her voice filled with awe. "Someone's been surviving out here for months, taking care of that baby." But it was what she found next that brought tears to her eyes. In the deepest corner of the shelter, partially covered by a blanket, were human remains. A skeleton wrapped in the tattered remnants of a woman's clothing, positioned as if the person had simply laid down and never gotten up again. "We found her," Officer Gonzalez called softly. "We found Monica Rivera." Sarah's knees gave out, and she sank to the forest floor. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, creating a picture both heartbreaking and miraculous. The crime scene technician worked through the night, carefully documenting and photographing the shelter and its contents. The story that emerged from the evidence was unlike anything any of them had ever encountered. Monica Rivera had been driving home from a friend's house on the night of March 15 when the storm hit. Her car had skidded off Highway 201 and down a steep embankment, leaving her stranded with her 3-month-old son, Carlos. Instead of waiting for help that might never come, she had made the fateful decision to try walking to safety. But the storm had been too severe, and she had become lost in the dense forest. Using remarkable survival skills and maternal determination, she had found this location and constructed the shelter. For weeks, possibly months, she had managed to keep herself and her baby alive through hunting, scavenging, and careful rationing of supplies she had somehow acquired. The evidence suggested she had survived for at least 2 months, possibly 3. But exposure, malnutrition, and the stress of trying to keep a baby alive in the wilderness had eventually taken their toll. The position of her remains suggested she had died peacefully, lying down beside her child as if taking a nap. But Carlos hadn't died with her. Somehow, he had survived for another 3 months after his mother's death. And the only possible explanation was Max. "It's impossible," the crime scene technician muttered, shaking his head as he examined the evidence. "A dog can't care for a human infant." But the proof was everywhere around them. Worn paths leading away from the shelter in multiple directions, evidence of Max's constant travels to find food and supplies. Cached items he had apparently stolen or scavenged from campsites, cabins, and hiking trails throughout the forest. Baby bottles that showed signs of being cleaned, though imperfectly. Even a small pile of pre-chewed meat, evidence that Max had been processing food for the infant the only way he knew how. "The timeline fits," Officer Gonzalez said, studying her notes. "Monica probably encountered Max during her first weeks here. Dogs are drawn to distress, especially domestic dogs. When she died, Max just took over." Sarah listened to all this while sitting beside Max in the clearing, her arms wrapped around his neck. She could feel how thin he had become, could see the wear and exhaustion in his eyes. For 6 months, he had lived a double life, traveling back and forth between this hidden shelter and the wider forest, hunting and scavenging to keep a human baby alive. How many supplies did he have to steal, she asked. Brady consulted his growing inventory. Dozens of items. Baby formula, bottles, blankets, even diapers. He must have hit every campsite and cabin within a 10-mile radius. The Rangers have been tracking a series of break-ins all summer, but they thought it was teenagers or transients. He was shopping, Sarah said, wonder and pride filling her voice. Max was shopping for baby supplies. The search team worked until dawn, cataloging evidence and ensuring Monica Rivera's remains were treated with proper respect. The baby, now identified as Carlos Rivera, was taken to the county hospital for a full medical evaluation. Despite his ordeal, he was in remarkably good condition for a child who had spent months in the wilderness. As the sun rose over the Oregon forest, Sarah sat on her porch with Max beside her, both of them exhausted but finally at peace. Max hadn't left her side since returning to the house, as if he was afraid she might disappear again. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the veterinarian who had examined Max, delivered her report with tears in her eyes. "He's severely underweight and shows signs of chronic stress," she said. "His cortisol levels are through the roof, indicating months of survival-level anxiety. But physiologically, he's in remarkable shape for what he's been through." "What about psychologically?" Sarah asked. Dr. Walsh stroked Max's head gently. "That's harder to assess. He's been carrying an enormous responsibility for 6 months. The stress of keeping that baby alive. I can't imagine what that would do to a dog's psyche. But he seems stable, alert, responsive. Whatever drove him to take on this task, he's accomplished it." The story exploded across local and national media within hours. Miracle dog saves baby after 6 months in wilderness. News trucks lined Sarah's street, reporters camped out on her lawn, and her phone rang constantly with interview requests from around the world. But Sarah was only interested in one thing: helping Max readjust to normal life. The first few days were the hardest. Max was jumpy, nervous, constantly alert for dangers that no longer existed. He would pace the house at all hours, checking windows and doors. He refused to eat normal dog food, apparently having subsisted for months on whatever he could catch or scavenge. But slowly, day by day, he began to relax. The first time he voluntarily lay down in his old bed was a breakthrough that brought Sarah to tears. The first time he played with one of his old toys was a celebration. 2 weeks after his return, Sarah received a visit that changed everything. Maria Rivera, Monica's sister and Carlos's aunt, arrived at Sarah's house carrying a small gift bag and struggling to contain her emotions. "I don't know how to thank you," she said through tears. "Or how to thank him." Max approached Maria cautiously, his tail wagging slowly. When she knelt down, he allowed her to pet him, even leaning into her touch. "He's been Carlos's guardian for 6 months, Maria continued. "The doctors say Carlos is healthy, thriving. They can't believe what good care he received, considering the circumstances." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "Max saved him. He saved your nephew's life." Maria nodded, pulling a small framed photo from the gift bag. It showed Monica holding baby Carlos, both of them smiling at the camera. "I wanted Max to have this," she said. "Monica would have wanted him to know how grateful she is." That evening, Sarah placed the photo on her mantel, right next to the picture of her and Max. As she was arranging it, Max came over and sat beside her, studying the new image. For a long moment, he stared at the photo of Monica and Carlos. Then he whined softly, a sound that seemed to contain all the sadness and love in the world. "You did good, boy," Sarah whispered, scratching behind his ears. "You kept your promise to her." 3 months later, Sarah received another phone call that brought her to tears. "Miss Coleman. This is Agent Jennifer Walsh with the FBI." "FBI?" Sarah asked, confused. "We've been investigating the pattern of thefts your dog committed while caring for the infant," the agent explained. "Following his trail led us to something unexpected. Several of the cabins he targeted were being used as distribution points for a major drug operation. Your dog's activities disrupted their supply chain enough that we were able to track and bust the entire network." Sarah looked at Max, who was sleeping peacefully by the fireplace. "He helped solve a drug case too." "One of the biggest in Oregon history," Agent Walsh confirmed. We recovered over $2 million in narcotics and arrested 15 people. Your dog is a hero in more ways than one. The Rivera family established a trust fund for Max's care, ensuring he would want for nothing for the rest of his life. But more importantly to Sarah, they maintained a relationship with her, and Max Carlos, now a healthy, happy baby, visited regularly, always lighting up when he saw the dog who had saved his life. Sarah began speaking at conferences and animal welfare events, telling Max's story and advocating for the remarkable intelligence and loyalty of rescue animals. She wrote a book, Guardian Angel with Four Paws, which became an international bestseller. But none of the fame or recognition mattered as much as the simple joy of having Max home. Every evening, as Sarah sat on her porch watching Max play in the yard, she thought about the miracle of what had happened. A dog had made a choice that defied everything scientists thought they knew about animal behavior. He had taken responsibility for a human life and carried it faithfully for 6 months, at enormous cost to himself. During Carlos's visits, Sarah would watch Max interact with the child and see something profound in the dog's eyes. Not just protectiveness, but recognition. Max knew this was the baby he had saved, and the bond between them was something beyond ordinary affection. One evening, as a spectacular Oregon sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah sat with Max on the porch while Carlos played nearby under Maria's watchful eye. The baby was babbling happily, taking his first tentative steps between the two women. "Do you think Monica knows?" Maria asked softly. Sarah looked at Max, who was watching Carlos with alert, gentle eyes. "I think she's been watching over all of them this whole time," she replied. "I think she guided Max to that shelter, and I think she's been with them every step of the way." As if summoned by their conversation, Carlos took 3 wobbly steps toward Max and fell into the dog's side. Instead of crying, the baby giggled and wrapped his small arms around Max's neck. Max remained perfectly still, allowing the child's affection, his tail wagging slowly. In that moment, Sarah saw the complete picture. Monica Rivera's love had transcended death, flowing through Max to keep her son alive. The dog had become a vessel for a mother's devotion, carrying it faithfully until help could arrive. 6 months later, Sarah received one final surprise. A package arrived with no return address, containing a letter and a small wooden carving. The letter was handwritten in Spanish, with an English translation attached. "Dear Sarah and Max, you don't know me, but I am Monica's mother, Carlos's grandmother. I wanted you to know that I have been following your story, and my heart is full of gratitude for what your dog did for my grandson. I carved this figure myself. It is Max as I see him, not just a dog, but an angel sent by my daughter to protect her son. I hope you will accept it as a small token of a grandmother's infinite gratitude. Carlos is thriving. He says his first word was doggy, and he asks for Max every day. He will grow up knowing the story of the dog who saved his life when his mother couldn't. With all my love and respect, Elena Rivera." The carving was exquisite, showing Max in a protective posture, his head raised and alert. At the base were carved the words, "Guardian Angel, March 2023. Sarah placed the carving on her mantle between the 2 photographs, her picture with Max, and Monica's picture with Carlos. The 3 images seemed to tell a complete story of love, loss, sacrifice, and redemption. That night, as Sarah prepared for bed, she found Max sitting by the window, looking out toward the forest. She knelt beside him and followed his gaze toward the trees where he had spent those long, difficult months. "Do you miss it?" she asked softly. "Do you miss taking care of him?" Max turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw something that took her breath away. Peace. For 6 months, he had carried a burden that would have broken most creatures. He had lived with the constant stress of keeping another being alive, never knowing if he was doing enough, never knowing if help would come. But now, seeing Carlos healthy and happy, knowing his mission was complete, Max had found peace. He pressed his head against Sarah's hand and sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that comes when a long journey finally ends. "You can rest now," Sarah whispered. "You did everything you were supposed to do." Outside, the Oregon wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and rain and something else, something that might have been the spirit of a grateful mother, finally at rest knowing her son was safe. Max closed his eyes and, for the first time in 6 months, slept without dreams of responsibility or fear. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the first day of the rest of his life. A life where he was not a guardian angel, but simply a beloved dog, home where he belonged. And in that simple transformation lay the true miracle of Max's story, not just that he had saved a life, but that he had found his way home to the love that had never stopped waiting for him. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because stories like Max's remind us that love knows no boundaries, loyalty knows no limits, and sometimes the greatest heroes walk on 4 paws, carrying hope through the darkest storms life can bring.